So talking about decoupled websites, it's an area of web architecture I've been very interested in for a number of years. And at Pantheon, we're interested in decoupled architectures because we think, especially over the next decade, decoupled architectures are going to be a big part of how we fulfill our mission in the world. We're here to make the open web a first-class platform that delivers results. If you'll indulge me for a minute, I'd like to talk just a bit about Pantheon as a whole and talk about the value we've traditionally delivered. So I first started using Pantheon before I was a Pantheon employee as a customer when I was leading Drupal teams building out sites for individual customers. And the restriction I always had to be working within was billable hours. And one way I'd like to think of it was I never wanted to be using a billable hour of my client on something like, what Linux distribution should we be using for the production infrastructure? What exactly is the perfect MySQL configuration? And Pantheon, for years and years, has solved that level of problems. We now call that level the serverless CMS idea. The idea that if you're making a Drupal or WordPress site, you shouldn't have to worry about the server level much at all. You shouldn't have to worry about memory settings and PHP INI. Similarly, we think teams often work better, faster when they don't have to reconstruct a developer workflow. We have this idea of structured agile workflows. A team can work on multiple features simultaneously in multiple multi-dev environments, and then at their own choosing, merge those code changes into a dev, test, live deployment pipeline in order to get them out into the world. And the more sites you have, the more valuable those kinds of features can be. If you, like some of our customers, are managing dozens, hundreds, even thousands of sites, you might benefit from the feature set that we call website portfolio management. We think those features come together well when you're working with a monolithic Drupal or WordPress site. And we think those features can be really handy when brought to bear in decoupled architectures. So Pantheon is increasing its investment and support for decoupled architectures, in short, because we think that's the tool set that more and more teams are picking in order to deliver the best possible web experiences. We think the decoupled tool set, the modern front-end frameworks out there have really raised the bar for what's possible on the web. I should say here at the top, as a TLDR, that this is meant to be an introductory session to the decoupled space. We're not going to see any code samples or anything like that. We'll run through the what, the why, the who, the where, the when, and close out a little bit with how. So to run through those in summary, what we're talking about essentially is a separation of code bases and architectures that serve the general public visiting your website, separate from what content editors or site administrators would experience in a CMS backend. The short answer to why I got into it there just now, we think that these architectures often enable you to deliver the best possible website. They raise the ceiling of what's possible. And one of the most critical ways we think they do that is often by increasing the web team's capacity to change the site. When you separate out the public-facing side from the back-end side, often the main reason to do that is to make that public-facing side more changeable more quickly. Ideally, adopting these kinds of architectures will involve the buy-in of everyone whose job it is to make changes to the website on a regular basis. Certain members of the team may find these architectures more appealing than others. Some members of the team may have to accept certain trade-offs and decreases in their work ease. That'll bring us into the where question. Where do you run a site that is decoupled? Many teams choose to use big cloud providers and build out much of the infrastructure themselves using cloud tooling. There are a number of specialized services. And Pantheon, we think, will be able to add value by enabling teams to put more of these architectures under one roof and solve much of the complexity that can come with splitting out back-end and front-end. The when for decoupling should ideally be when decoupling aligns with the goals of the website, which isn't always going to be true. That'll bring us as well into the question of how. How can a team successfully decouple? And in short, I think the way to do that is one step at a time rather than one gigantic relaunch project. To dive a bit deeper in, let's talk about what is decoupled Drupal or a decoupled CMS. A common pattern here is, again, to separate out where content editors are going. Their traffic is going to a backend CMS like Drupal or WordPress. That's separate from the public-facing front-end experience, which is often these days going to be built in a tool like React or Vue.js. As I've been working on this presentation and in this space, figuring out which logos to put in there has been a difficult question. I was happy to see at the Dries note last week at DrupalCon, Dries also had React and Vue logos as the front-end frameworks that seem to have risen to the top, at least in the Drupal and WordPress community. So those components are reading data from that back-end CMS in one way or another. Depending on some nuance here, when and where that reading happens can be different. Many of the sites using this model are making the front end be a static architecture, basically flat files on a content delivery network. Gatsby, again, in the Drupal and WordPress space, seems to be the most popular emerging option for doing this kind of architecture. This architecture requires a build step. It requires that this Gatsby static front end be compiled, so to speak, reading in data from Drupal or WordPress, combining that data with the front end React components. A big benefit here is that this is just about the most scalable way to run a site. Also get some security benefits here from the front end, having no web server to hack at. But that fundamental infrastructure also may require you to rethink some things like authentication, web forms, and other features that you may have taken for granted in a Drupal and WordPress, where there's always an origin server there, always with a database available. A less drastic shift is what I like to call a parallel dynamic runtime. Here again, we have a split between where public traffic is going and where content editors are going. The difference is mainly in the language or the runtime that sits behind that CDN. For the CMS, we would still have Drupal or WordPress, presumably running in PHP. And then on the front end side, the public-facing side, we would have Node.js executing with those React components or Vue.js components. With a model like this, you may not need as many changes to your workflow. You might be able to deploy these applications in parallel through something like a dev test live deployment pipeline. The main benefit you may be going for here is getting your front-end developers using the language and tools that they prefer. One other option I feel like I should address does not have that clear split between where content editors go and where the public goes. It's called progressive decoupling. As I was working on this slide deck the past few weeks, I plan to talk about this as an option that seemed to be losing popularity. It's an option that Dries, the founder of Drupal, has been talking about for a number of years as a good model to pursue. And there were at least 2 sessions at DrupalCon that covered this, but I should describe what exactly we mean here with progressive decoupling. If we have a Drupal site, or it could be a WordPress site as well, with a header, a main body area, a sidebar, component by component, block by block, view mode by view mode, perhaps, you could decide this part of the website, just this one block, or just this one sidebar element. This element would benefit from a switch to traditional Drupal rendering of markup to something like React or Vue.js. And there may be any number of reasons to do that, but the idea here is that we slowly move from a monolithic model to a decoupled model, component by component. I think this will be easier to understand if we can first build a common understanding of what exactly do we mean by a monolithic CMS, and what benefits are we getting from a monolithic CMS when we have our content, our display all living in one place, in one system. I think I can highlight the benefits of a monolithic CMS by talking about the first mobile optimization project that I had to address in my days as an agency developer. Back around 2010, I was living in Chicago, working at an agency, and a small private elementary school came to our agency and said, we need our site to work better on iPhones specifically. They had a Drupal 6 site at the time, just got a screenshot here of a plain Drupal 6 site. Their site didn't look all too different from this stock theme. This site had a few hundred nodes, information about the school. Almost all those nodes were organized into the sidebar menu, a primary nav across the top. And like so many fixed width websites, it didn't look great when you loaded it on an iPhone. So the challenge that this school presented to me and the agency that I was working at was make it work just as well on the iPhone, because we have these parents that need to sign into the website in order to keep up to date with what's happening on the school. We're concerned these parents won't do that if it doesn't work at all on the phone. I thought this project might take a couple days or a couple weeks, but with the benefits of monolithic Drupal, I could, in about an afternoon, make a child theme, just extending that same theme that was used on their regular site, override the handling of the menu, do some jQuery magic to give it a hamburger menu sort of effect, override the styling of the images so that the widths worked appropriately, the lightly formatted body text pretty much all stayed the same. And I thought, yeah, this is the benefit of monolithic Drupal. We put all of our data into one system, organize it, and just naturally out the other side, we get well-formatted HTML that can be styled and overridden as necessary. And if you've got a good understanding of how Drupal works, you can make an experience on the iPhone that works just as well as it did on the desktop. So why am I telling that story in the context of decoupling? Well, I think in 2010, underestimated the scope of the challenge that these devices presented. I think I didn't fully grasp what this customer really needed. And now 10 years later, their website is not a Drupal website. They've gone on to another system. In the last 10 years, the expectations have shifted greatly. If we think about this problem space from the perspective of those parents, from the perspective of the people using these platforms, the expectations have really risen. I'm now a parent sending my child to a daycare in my case, and I stay connected to what's happening at that daycare through an app. Sure, I would prefer that connection were happening over a website, but in that app, I get push notifications about snack time. Now during the pandemic, we have to do contactless drop-off. So I need to use the app to scan a QR code. The capabilities that are needed with my phone to keep the connection to that school are just greater than I originally assumed. I had thought that responsive design was the hard part of making the open web competitive on these devices. I thought that we would need to make our websites as fast as possible, and that these things could be addressed just as well with monolithic Drupal. That was my impression in the early days. But it is bigger than that. These mobile browsers are often underpowered, and there are some legitimate security reasons to limit what browsers can do on an iPhone. But we also need to recognize that it is to Apple's benefit, to many device makers' benefit, to push activity to push the way we use these devices from the web into native applications. These devices have formed a different relationship with technology between the people using the devices and the businesses making these pieces of technology, these applications. We as technologists need to deliver more types of value. At Pantheon, we think there are basically five reasons at a very high level that someone might pay you to make a website. That school was coming to my agency with a request around daily active users. They wanted to keep parents signing in to the website. If the site doesn't work on an iPhone, that's a problem. But a school may need any one of these things. A school may need, for instance, to find the next incoming class of students. To do that, they're going to need unique users reach. They're going to need the tools of lead generation. A website can do that, but so can things like Facebook ads and other sorts of native applications. A school might want to collect tuition digitally. They might want to sell sweatshirts. And again, you can do that through the website, but if it's too difficult, if it's too much work to make that happen through the web, you can do that through the Amazon Marketplace. You can do that through any number of closed platforms. For the open web to be competitive, the open web needs not only to enable us makers of websites to compete with the next website over, but we also need to compete with closed platforms. In order to do that, we as technologists need to make sure we're spending as much time as possible thinking and focusing on the reason these websites exist. We like to, at Pantheon, to break this down into somewhat of 3 levels of where is your focus, where is your time going as a web team. Ideally, you're focusing on the impact level, but many web teams just struggle to get features out the door, working at the productivity level. Some teams need to focus on the credibility level, just keeping the website up, keeping it performant, keeping it secure. A big part of the appeal for decoupled architectures, in my opinion, is that they often enable a team to move their focus up towards the top. A static architecture, for instance, might make this credibility level much easier to address. If your public-facing site is flat files on a CDN, you don't have to worry so much about the uptime, the basic performance, the security. A static front end lets you address that that credibility level often in a cleaner way. The productivity level also, I think, can be addressed often in a better way with a decoupled architecture. If you have a monolithic site at Pantheon, we think it's a good idea to move changes, nearly any change to your website, through a multi-step deployment pipeline. We've got multi-dev, dev, test, all before going to live. And in each of these environments, you might answer a different question, like, does this change meet my team standards? Did I break anything? Does the site owner approve? And you might use a different environment for each one of those things. The situation you want to avoid is deploying a broken code change to your live environment. You might break your database. Having these separate steps is beneficial more often with a monolithic site. If you split your site in 2, if you make the front end less risky to make changes to, it might be acceptable to answer all of these questions together. It might be acceptable to have a one-step deployment pipeline where any change can go to a multi-dev-like environment. If you're using pull requests, you get a preview environment per pull request. And assuming that the change is good, you merge and immediately go to live. You can address that productivity level in a much faster way, and again, have more time to focus on the impact. We at Pantheon think pretty much every web team needs to be completing cycles of designing, building, and measuring their work. For many teams, these cycles take weeks or months, sometimes years, to do a total rebuild of the site, to complete one of these cycles. The pressure that we have to keep competing with native apps and to stay competitive as technologists, I think encourages us to shrink these cycles as small as possible. And decoupling, I think, is a big way to do that. There are a few team members that I think benefit most from that faster cycle. For instance, the stakeholders, the people asking for these kinds of changes, would really like the idea that they could review the new change to the website, review the new header component, for instance, approve it, say they like it, and immediately see it live on the website. Stakeholders often don't want to hear that their feature that they've been asking for now needs to wait until the end of the sprint or longer in order to be deployed, along with a number of other changes. Designers, I think, also really benefit from this shrinking of the deployment cycle. Designers, I think, often benefit from seeing how real-world users use their features. If we have a shorter deployment pipeline where designers can try out a new component, get some level of approval that it's good enough to deploy live, they can complete cycles of iteration that get those changes out to live rather than iterating over and over again in a non-live environment, trying to get it perfect because that path out to live is so slow. Front-end developers, kind of in the middle here, benefit a whole lot as well from decoupled architectures. I think front-end developers in our ecosystem have been the main driver of this architecture. And for front-end developers, a big part of it is that the browser has gotten so complicated. We're expecting our websites to do so much, again, often in order to stay competitive with native applications, that it's just unreasonable to expect front-end developers to also keep up with all the implementation details of a Drupal or WordPress. There are literally 10 layers of processing and pre-processing available to every theme hook in Drupal. Is it reasonable to hire a front-end developer and expect them to learn that in addition to all of the things they need to learn in order to keep up in the front-end ecosystem? For a number of years at these kinds of conferences, we've had reoccurring jokes about just the sheer number of frameworks, front-end frameworks that come out every single day for a while, it seemed. I think it's important, though, to recognize that a decade plus into this movement, the pace at which new frameworks is coming out has slowed down. I think Vue and React have really risen to the top. But it's also important to remember what it was that was motivating that push to iterate so quickly, to change everything in front-end development. And it was, I think, in large part to make the idea of single-page applications, the idea of web applications that could be competitive with native applications, reality. It's important to recognize here that all these members of the team need to come together in order to make something that's going to be effective. Web ops, as we see it at Pantheon, is a team sport. Any architecture you might pursue needs to make sense for every member of the team. As we address the where question, we may find some team members who have more reservations about decoupling. System administrators or your DevOps engineers may ask some legitimate questions like, where are we putting this stuff? Many of the teams that I've talked to as I've been leading research and development efforts at Pantheon choose to do things directly on AWS or Google Cloud. This is a reasonable choice to make, but if you are also decoupling, you may be doubling the number of things that your system administrators need to understand. I'm not expecting anyone here to read the details of these diagrams. The thing I want to highlight here is that it's a lot of complexity to take on for a system administrator to say, we're going to run even just a monolithic Drupal site directly in AWS. That's a lot of services to provision, a lot of arrows to understand. It's unlikely that a person with this level of responsibility will have much time left over to focus time and attention at that top impact level. So some teams choose to use a composition of specialized services. Front-end focused products like Netlify and Vercel often make a lot of sense here. But again, teams I've talked to as I've been doing some research have expressed pain points around, we've got our backend on Pantheon, a front end somewhere else, a build process in the middle. Code is getting committed on GitHub. It's too many pieces to keep track of. So we think at Pantheon that we'll be able to differentiate, add some value by putting backend and front end in one place. And again, solving as many detailed questions as we can at the platform level. Sticking with the question of where here, backend developers, I consider myself first and foremost a backend developer. And for many years, I've been asking, if we're cutting off Drupal's head, where exactly is Drupal's neck? Again, 10 layers of processing and pre-processing available in monolithic Drupal. Where is the slice happening? In the years since I started asking that question, I think we've gotten an answer. In Drupal and in WordPress, the answers are very similar. In Drupal, it seems to be JSON API, a module in core, GraphQL, a more popular option in the wider front-end community, available in Drupal as a contributed module. WordPress has a similar split between a REST API in core and GraphQL available as a contributed plugin. Either one you choose, I think, can make for a more productive conversation between back-end and front-end developers than you would have in monolithic Drupal. With decoupling, you can ask, are we addressing this bit of complexity before or after we send the data out over the API? If we need to customize this particular component in a way that we hadn't anticipated, is this component customization happening in the front end, or is this something that needs to happen before data gets sent out over the API? Your marketers or site owners might be overhearing these conversations about chopping off Drupal's head, and they might be asking, so what's left? Why are we using Drupal or WordPress at all? After we start chopping off pieces of our monolithic CMS, what's left over? What shouldn't be chopped away? The way I like to think about it is essentially, what is the heart of a headless CMS? If we're chopping away pieces, what's left over? I think it's the open source part, and I think it's the content management system part is the heart of a headless open source content management system. There are fundamental benefits that you get from an open source piece of software that you would not get from a software as a service application for content management. You get full control, full ownership of your content. Websites are usually the most important digital asset that a company has. The content is often the most important part of that website. I think it's critical to keep as much ownership as you can over the content itself, its structure, its organization, who can edit what. These are complex questions that Drupal and WordPress have been answering for about 2 decades. And the answers they've often come up with are pretty good. When decoupling, those content editors, of course, should also be aware of the things they might lose. Monolithic CMSs often give you page layout modules, page layout capabilities, previewing, the instantaneous publishing of content. And if you chop your site in half, you might lose some of those pieces. You may not have the CMS controlling in a fine-grained way exactly what the layout is, the way you would with a panelizer or a layout builder module. I think these trade-offs are often acceptable, so long as the content editors know what they're getting into. And to talk about that a bit more, I'd like to highlight one of the customers we've been working with at Pantheon when it comes to decoupled architectures. WP Campus is a professional organization, WordPress people at higher education institutions, and they chose to do their front end in Gatsby. They didn't lose the essence of WordPress, in my opinion, by doing that change. This may seem like an existential question. It doesn't make sense for a WordPress organization to not use WordPress itself for the display. I think so. WordPress is best at controlling the publishing experience. Gatsby is particularly good at displaying data. Rachel Cherry, the director of WP Campus, likes the trade-off that you get here. So if you go to www.wpcampus.org today, you'll see this Gatsby site. They got a number of benefits from this switch. The site got significantly faster, a little bit better on best practices measurements, and one more detail I want to emphasize with this particular project is that it was not a full relaunch. This project, or this site, I should say, is actually a WordPress site network site with a number of subdomains. And it was just the www public-facing side that switched over to Gatsby. The WordPress half didn't have to change all that much. The post types and so on, the content itself changed very little, which leads me a bit into when does it make sense to decouple your website. And in short, I think it makes sense when decoupling will move you closer to your top level goals. That may be because the site needs a level of interaction design that's just not realistic in a monolithic Drupal or WordPress site. You may need those latest and greatest tools in React and Vue.js for creating exactly what the front end experience is that you want. If you aren't exactly sure what your front-end site needs to be, but you need to get it live and then iterate on it, splitting up the site into back-end and front-end might help you achieve those goals. That might help you get something live sooner that you can then change faster. And for some teams, it may be enough that they have a decoupled team. A team may already have a very clear split between who is a back-end developer and who is a front-end developer, and navigating that split in a monolithic CMS hasn't been easy. It'll be easier to manage in a decoupled architecture, and you'll simply be more productive. That alone might be enough. Also, sticking onto the idea of when, I would recommend not all at once. Some of the teams I've talked to have been conceptualizing their move to decoupling as something like, we have a giant Drupal 7 site, it's got a whole bunch of content types, a whole lot of nodes, and we've got like a year now to switch it to Drupal 8 or 9 and relaunch it in Gatsby. I think that's a risky idea. There are so many changes, so many details that'll be different between these two experiences in terms of how the people responsible for that site will go about maintaining it day to day, that these kinds of switches should be validated, I think, one by one or in the smallest possible ways. So, for instance, can we, in some small way, confirm the assumption that decoupling will actually get us more conversions? One of the teams that I've been talking to has the assumption that if they decouple their monolithic WordPress site, they'll get better results, more people clicking on the things that they want to click on. So the page they're starting with, the page that they will first decouple, is the careers page. It's a page that has a pretty clear purpose. They want people to apply to work at this company. So they can go about decoupling it and then ask, did we actually get more quality job applicants after we switched this one page to Next.js in their case? If the answer is no, it made no difference whatsoever in the number of conversions, or if it actually made the number of conversions go down, that should be a big warning sign that it may not be a good idea to keep proceeding, switching the site from monolithic WordPress to decoupled WordPress and Next.js. There may be some nuance there, though, if just that switch allows the developers to collaborate faster. If that switch of the careers page doesn't change the number of people clicking on the apply button, but it does make for a better back and forth between backend and front end developers, it might be worth it. They may also find that the back and forth gets worse. The content editors may find that they don't like some of the details. And if these details can be worked out on a single page, a single microsite, a single slice of your website rather than the whole thing, I think you're setting yourselves up for better results. Similarly, system administrators or the DevOps engineers should find some way of validating that what they're being asked to run can be supported on the platforms they're using. Also here in the how section, I'd like to highlight some cases beyond a one-to-one relationship between backend and front end. Many of these sites are what I like to call front end only. We just saw in the last hour that the bodiless session, the idea that the content and the components, the front end components, are living together in the same repository. Pantheon's own documentation site is essentially doing that same thing, where we've got our content in Markdown files. The front end experience is built out in Gatsby's React components, and all changes to the site can flow in the same direction. And for our documentation team, that means that they're able to focus on the reason the site exists. They're able to focus more on the documentation. If they were using the content workflow of Drupal, where content changes on a live site and code changes have to move up dev test live, that running of changes in two opposite directions wouldn't be helpful to them. Moving everything in one direction with a front end only experience is simply better for that particular team. I also think decoupling will open the door for what I like to call decoupled custom upstreams, where we can have, in addition to a clear separation between backend and front end, a clear separation between a single lockdown content editing experience with many customized front ends. This might be helpful for a publishing operation that has many regional publications. I think this could be helpful for, say, a university that has many similar academic departments that it wants to serve, and they'll see some benefit to keeping a lockdown content editing experience with customization happening only visually in components. The content meshes is kind of Gatsby's view of the world, somewhat of the inverse there. The idea behind the content mesh is that past a certain point of complexity, any website is going to have multiple data sources, and it's unreasonable to assume that the data needed by a complex website can be satisfied by just Drupal or just WordPress. And you should assume that any website will have API information being read in from a weather API, or some content coming in from Airtable here. And if the front end experience is just built for that assumption first, you'll set yourselves up for better results, perhaps. Also on the how here, the how from Pantheon is that we're addressing our investments kind of in a phased approach. I've been leading a prototype and pilot project effort where we've figured out what's working, applied our research and development to a small handful of customers, and we'll then move that into a custom delivery phase run through our professional services team, where we're building individual implementations for individual customers. We also have our product team coming on board now for a full platform answer that will move through a limited and general availability phase. If you're interested in this space, if you're a Pantheon customer that would like to talk with our product team that's right now doing customer interviews to make sure they've got a handle on the whole space, fill out this form, please, and we'll get a conversation set up with our product team. In closing here, I'd again like to say that we at Pantheon think that decoupled websites are going to be a critical part of keeping the open web competitive over the next decade to come. They'll be a big part of how we fulfill our mission to keep the open web a platform for delivering results. Thanks so much. We've got a few minutes for questions here.
The first question from Alexander Varvik. When will more details about Pantheon's front-end hosting plans be available?
I don't have a firm date to give you, but we've got teams working on it actively right now.
Cool. And since I get to ask my own question,
Sure.
So using a Gatsby site, what's been your experience with needing to do full site rebuild when you have to update common components like headers, footers? I know maybe a year ago that might have been the largest detractor from Gatsby in terms of scale. What has been your experience?
My experience is that is a concern. Gatsby as a company is actively working on that particular question of I'm forgetting the word that they use, incremental builds. Yeah. The idea that we only need to update the parts of the website that actually were updated. And what I've seen from Gatsby Cloud looks very promising.
Cool. Next question. Chip Moser. Is Pantheon planning to offer a solution for node-based SSR in decoupled architectures?
Short answer, we're looking into it. Again, our product team is coming onto the project right now to scope out exactly what our first product offering will be. In this phase of prototypes and pilot projects, we're looking at both static and that what I call parallel dynamic runtime, where Node is running on a server and doing server-side rendering.